Fletcher was 66 when his hands first started going numb after breakfast. It wasn't every day at first, just a slight tingling in his fingers, like the pins and needles sensation you get when you sleep on your arm wrong. He brushed it off. Thought maybe he was holding his fork too tightly, or maybe the weather was changing again. But then it started happening more often. The mornings felt foggy. He'd eat his toast, sip his coffee, and then sit there for an hour, feeling tired instead of full. His energy would dip before noon, and by the afternoon, his knees ached like they hadn't in years. At first, Fletcher blamed age. "It's just what happens," he said when his daughter asked him about the swelling in his ankles. He didn't want to admit it, but deep down he knew something wasn't quite right. When the blurred vision started, though, he could no longer pretend. He was in the middle of reading the newspaper when the words smudged like wet ink. That was the day he went to the doctor. That was the day the word pre-diabetic came into his life like a quiet storm. I remember sitting across from him at my kitchen table the next morning. He was holding that little slip of paper they give you at the clinic, the one with your blood test results, like it had betrayed him. "But I don't even eat sweets," he said, his voice a mix of confusion and fear. That's the thing about blood sugar. It doesn't always come from obvious places. Sometimes it's the foods we think are good for us, the ones we've been told to trust for years, the toast, the cereal, the rice. Fletcher was doing what he thought was right, but it was hurting him quietly. That moment became a turning point for him, not because he suddenly decided to follow some strict diet, but because he got curious. He asked me what I eat. He started writing down how he felt after meals. He told me, "Doc, I want to feel full and feel good afterward." And that right there was where the shift began. Not in fear, in clarity. I told him something most people don't hear enough, that not all grains are the enemy. In fact, some of them are the very foods that could help his body heal, lower inflammation, support his nerves, and even protect his eyes and kidneys. And that these grains, they weren't rare or expensive. They were right there in his local grocery store. He just needed to know which ones to choose and how to let them work with his body, not against it. What happened in the months that followed surprised even me. Fletcher didn't just change his plate, he changed the way he thought about food. He stopped fearing carbs, he stopped chasing every fad. He began to eat in a way that honored his body. His mornings became steadier, the tingling faded, his eyes stopped blurring when he read. And when he walked back into my clinic for his follow-up labs, the numbers told a completely different story. So today, I want to tell you the same thing I told Fletcher. There are grains out there that don't just fill you up, they lift you up. They support your blood sugar, your gut, your heart, and your strength. And some of the ones on this list might surprise you, especially the last one. It's not rice, it's not oats. But it could be the one that changes everything. Stick with me. This might be the missing piece you've been looking for. Fletcher had always been a creature of habit. For 30 years, his mornings began the same way. A slice of toast, 2 boiled eggs, black coffee, and the front page of the newspaper folded neatly on the table. He liked things quiet, predictable, but lately his body had started whispering things he couldn't ignore. It was the kind of whisper that comes in the form of fatigue that sinks into your bones by 10 a.m., or fingers that feel stiff even after stretching. His knees had started to ache, his eyes couldn't hold focus like before, and worst of all, the numbness in his hands, the thing he brushed off as just getting older, was becoming routine. The morning that truly changed him began like any other. But after finishing his usual breakfast, Fletcher tried to stand up and something felt wrong. His legs wobbled under him as if they were confused about what to do next. His hands tingled sharply, not the light pins and needles, but a burning buzz that made him drop his coffee cup. It didn't break, but the splash startled him. He stared at his trembling hands, suddenly afraid. That's when he called his doctor. The appointment felt surreal. The nurse checked his blood pressure twice, then asked if he had fasted. Fletcher said yes. Then the doctor, the one who'd been seeing him for years, sat down across from him with a look he didn't like. "Your blood sugar is elevated," she said gently, "and your A1C is at the threshold. You're pre-diabetic, Fletcher." He blinked, trying to understand what that really meant. He didn't eat sweets, didn't drink soda, barely touched dessert. How could this happen? Later that day, he found himself sitting on the porch, his test results crumpled in his fist. His daughter, Dana, came by with groceries. She knew the look on his face before he said anything. "Talk to me, Dad," she said. Fletcher looked at her, trying to form words that didn't sound like failure. "I thought I was doing everything right," he said softly. "I didn't know..." toast could do this to me." She sat beside him and squeezed his hand. "Maybe it's not about doing everything right," she said. "Maybe it's about doing what's right for you now." That conversation lingered in Fletcher's mind. That night, he didn't sleep well. He kept thinking about how his body had changed without him noticing. It scared him, but something else stirred underneath the fear. Curiosity. What if there were foods that could actually help? Not punish, not restrict, but support him? He remembered the doctor mentioning something in passing, how some grains, especially those with fiber and a lower glycemic index, could make a real difference. Not all carbs were bad, just the wrong kind at the wrong time. And the right ones, they could help steady his blood sugar, feed his gut, even protect his nerves. That idea stuck with him like a seed freshly planted. The next morning, Fletcher stood in the kitchen longer than usual. He skipped the toast. Instead, he opened his cabinet and pulled down the tin of steel-cut oats he had bought on a whim months ago and never touched. He cooked it slowly, added cinnamon and a few walnuts, then sat down with a new sense of intention. The oats were warm, nutty, unfamiliar. But they didn't leave him crashing. They left him grounded. It wasn't a miracle. It was just better. And in that quiet moment, Fletcher realized that maybe this wasn't about losing control. Maybe this was about regaining it, one breakfast at a time. A few weeks after Fletcher swapped out his morning toast for steel-cut oats, he noticed something strange. He wasn't crashing by 10 a.m. anymore. The fog that used to settle behind his eyes before lunch, it had lifted. But the real surprise came one afternoon when he bent down to tie his shoes and realized he hadn't thought about his knees all day. They hadn't ached, hadn't stiffened, hadn't whispered their usual complaints. He sat there for a moment, his fingers still wrapped around the laces, thinking, was that just a fluke? Or was something actually changing? He brought it up during his next visit with me. "I don't know what's going on," he said with a hesitant smile, "but I feel like something's shifted. I've been eating oats most mornings, and I haven't needed pain cream in almost a week." I smiled back. "Sometimes, Fletcher, small changes change everything." That afternoon, we talked for a long time. About blood sugar, yes, but also about beliefs, the kind that are hard to let go of. He'd always been told that carbs were bad, that grains in particular were dangerous if you had blood sugar issues. But now he was seeing firsthand that wasn't always true. "I thought all grains were the same," he said quietly. "Turns out I was wrong." I introduced him to a grain he'd never heard of before. Quinoa, light, nutty, protein-rich, and best of all, it had all 9 essential amino acids. "It's not rice," I said, "but it cooks like it. And for someone like you, it can be a powerhouse." He was skeptical. "It sounds fancy," he said, raising an eyebrow. "Is it going to taste like birdseed?" I laughed. "Only if you don't know how to dress it up." Dana helped him that week. She brought over a Tupperware of warm quinoa with roasted vegetables and lemon zest and sat beside him while he took his first bite. "Not bad," he admitted after chewing slowly. "Kind of earthy, but good," she nodded. "Told you." It became a new part of his rotation. One night, he sautéed it with garlic and mushrooms. Another day, he used it in a cold salad with chickpeas and parsley. And after each meal, he felt light, balanced, not heavy and swollen like he often did after eating pasta or white rice. But what really struck Fletcher was what wasn't happening. The numbness in his hands, the thing that once terrified him, had started to fade. The tingling wasn't gone, not completely, but it no longer kept him up at night. And his blood pressure, which used to spike randomly, was becoming more stable. His daughter noticed too. "You're more present, Dad," she said one evening over dinner. "You don't zone out as much anymore." That hit him deep, because for the past year, he'd been slowly withdrawing from the world without realizing it, skipping golf, avoiding morning walks, turning down dinner invites, not because he didn't want to go, but because he didn't feel like himself. Now something was returning, not just strength, but clarity, confidence. Still, he kept asking himself the same question over and over. Why didn't anyone tell me this sooner? Why wasn't it more common knowledge that some grains, like quinoa, could actually support diabetics instead of harm them? That night, Fletcher sat down with a pen and a yellow notepad. He titled the page, "Grains That Don't Hurt Me," and underneath wrote, "Steel-cut oats." Quinoa. He stared at the list for a moment and smiled. It was short, but it was growing. And for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel afraid of food. He felt informed, empowered, like he was building a relationship with his body instead of fighting it. He didn't know it yet, but the next grain on his journey would not only change his meals, it would change his mindset. It had been 2 months since Fletcher had made his first change. He hadn't touched white bread in weeks, hadn't looked at instant oatmeal and rice, the staple he once relied on, now sat untouched in the back of the pantry. But even with the steel-cut oats and quinoa working well for him, there were days where his blood sugar still spiked unexpectedly. Not wildly, but enough to make him question whether he was really in control at all. One evening, after a long walk, something he was doing more of these days, he sat on his porch with a puzzled look. Dana dropped by again, bringing him a new container of groceries. She had this habit of picking out things he'd never heard of. She reached into the bag and pulled out a small sack of barley. "What am I supposed to do with that?" he asked with a half smile. "It looks like bird feed," she laughed. "Trust me, it's the grain no one talks about, but it's the calmest one I've found." Fletcher didn't understand what she meant by calm, but that word stuck with him. So the next morning, he looked up barley, whole barley to be specific. Glycemic index, low, fiber, high. Benefits, almost suspiciously good. What caught his attention most was how it worked, slowly, steadily, releasing sugar into the bloodstream without triggering the roller coaster he was trying to get off of. It reminded him of something his doctor once said: "Some foods speak gently to your body, others yell." That night, he made a barley stew. Garlic, carrots, onions, celery. Simple, warm, humble. And when he finished eating, he noticed something he hadn't felt in a while. Nothing. No heaviness, no bloating, no wave of exhaustion, just stillness. It felt like his body was saying, "Thank you." Over the next 2 weeks, barley became his evening companion. He swapped it into soups, tossed it with herbs and olive oil, even tried it for breakfast once with chopped apples and cinnamon. And during those weeks, something else happened. The mental noise that used to fill his head around food, the anxiety, the second guessing, the guilt, it began to quiet. That's what he meant when he came into my office and said, "Barley calms me." He wasn't just talking about blood sugar. He was talking about the rhythm of eating, the feeling of steadiness after a meal, no longer riding the sharp peaks and dips, no longer holding his breath after every bite, waiting to see how his body would react. I told him something that made his eyes water. "You've turned a corner, Fletcher. Your numbers aren't just improving, you're living differently." And he was. He stood straighter, walked farther, slept deeper. He'd even started playing cards again with his old Tuesday night group, something he'd avoided for nearly a year. One of his friends noticed. "What's gotten into you?" the guy asked, half joking. Fletcher didn't launch into a lecture. He just said, "I've stopped eating things that confuse my body, that's all." And it was true. Barley hadn't just helped his blood sugar, it had helped restore trust between him and his own body. One night he sat down with that same yellow notepad, added a third grain to the list. Steel-cut oats, quinoa, barley. He underlined barley twice, not because it was flashy, but because it was gentle. And in this new season of his life, gentle was exactly what he needed. But life wasn't done teaching him. There was one more lesson, and it came in the form of a grain he'd avoided for years, one he'd been told to fear and was about to see in a whole new light. Fletcher hadn't touched rice in nearly a year. It wasn't just a decision, it was a reaction. Rice, especially white rice, had been stamped into his mind as dangerous the moment he heard the word pre-diabetic. He used to love it, especially with his Sunday meals, but once his diagnosis came, he pushed it away like it was poison. Even brown rice, which people called the healthier version, was something he didn't trust. It sat untouched in the cupboard, like a guilty memory. That changed one evening when Dana invited him over for dinner. He had started visiting her more now, not just for help, but because he genuinely felt better and wanted to be around people again. The table smelled like ginger and garlic, stir-fried vegetables steamed beside a small bowl of brown rice. Fletcher paused when he saw it. "You know I don't eat that," he said, his voice low but certain. Dana looked up from her plate. "I know, Dad, but I think you should try it again, just a little." He raised an eyebrow. "Why?" She smiled. "Because it's not the rice, it's how we treat it. It's how much we take. It's what we pair it with." He stared at the bowl. It wasn't a mountain of rice like he used to serve himself. It was maybe half a cup, surrounded by vegetables, tofu, a drizzle of sesame oil. Balanced, humble, curious, he took a forkful. Chewed slowly, it had a chew to it, a nuttiness he'd forgotten. He waited for the guilt, for the anxiety, but it didn't come, just warmth and satisfaction. The next morning, he checked his sugar and braced himself. But the number was steady, slightly elevated from his usual quinoa breakfast, sure, but well within range. He stared at the meter for a long time. "Huh," he whispered, "so it can be done." He came into my office the following week with that familiar look, part pride, part confusion. "I ate rice again," he said with a slow smile. "Brown rice, didn't spike. I measured." I nodded. "It's not about fear, Fletcher, it's about context, about proportion. Rice isn't the villain, it's just been misused." That hit him deeper than he expected, because so much of what he'd done in the past few months, the oats, the barley, the quinoa, it all came from a place of adding in. Brown rice was the first thing he had to reclaim, something he loved, something he was told to fear. And now he was learning how to meet it again, not with shame, but with understanding. That week he cooked brown rice on his own, just half a cup. He added chopped kale, grilled salmon, and lemon zest. No sauces, no distractions, just real food in real balance. And when he finished, he felt full, not stuffed, satisfied, not spiked. And something else happened that week too. He went for a walk with an old friend from his community center. They used to walk together every Saturday morning until Fletcher pulled away months ago. Now they walked a full mile together. At one point, the friend turned to him and said, "You look lighter." Fletcher chuckled. "Brown rice," he said, "and a whole lot of letting go." That night, he returned to the notepad. Steel-cut oats, quinoa, barley, brown rice. He stared at the fourth line for a long time. It didn't feel like a betrayal. It felt like healing, like getting something back. Not just a food, but a piece of himself. And just when he thought he had seen all the grains worth knowing, he stumbled upon one that wasn't even a grain at all, and yet it would become one of the most powerful allies in his journey. Fletcher wasn't expecting to be impressed by something called buckwheat. For one, the name confused him. It sounded like wheat, the very thing he thought he was supposed to avoid. But he was in the health aisle of the grocery store looking for his usual steel-cut oats when he saw a small paper bag labeled Organic Buckwheat Groats. Something about it stopped him. Maybe it was the word ancient. Maybe it was the simplicity of the packaging, but he picked it up and turned it over. Gluten-free, low glycemic, high in magnesium and fiber. A good source of something called rutin, which supposedly helped blood vessels and eye health. He wasn't sure why, but his eyes stayed on that last part, the part about vision. Ever since the blurring incident months ago, he'd had a quiet fear about losing his sight. He didn't talk about it much, not even to Dana, but it lived there, in the back of his mind, whispering what-ifs whenever he skipped a walk or had a sugar craving. What if you lose your eyes next? So that day, Fletcher took the buckwheat home, cooked it soft like porridge, added cinnamon and a spoonful of almond butter. It wasn't love at first bite, but it was interesting. He ate it slowly, as if listening to how his body would respond. And just like with barley, there was no crash, no fog, just peace. He called me a few days later. "This one's different," he said. "I don't know how to explain it, but it feels like it's working behind the scenes." I smiled on the other end of the line. That's exactly what it does. Over the next week, he kept experimenting. Buckwheat pancakes, buckwheat salad with cucumbers and lemon, buckwheat and lentil soup, and with each meal, his blood sugar stayed in range. His hands stayed steady, but more importantly, his confidence returned. One morning, he went to the eye doctor, a follow-up from 6 months prior. He hadn't told me he was nervous, but I could hear it in his voice when he recounted the visit later. "No progression," he said, "no damage to the vessels." He let the words settle for a moment. "I thought I was going to lose my eyesight," he whispered, "but I'm still here. I can still see." That night, he sat at his table with his notepad again. This time, he didn't write quickly. He took a breath first, then added, "Steel-cut oats, quinoa, barley, brown rice, buckwheat." There was something sacred about that fifth line, like a quiet triumph, like a thank you note to his body. This wasn't about fads or health trends. It was about listening to his body, to the food, to the science he used to ignore. He was learning that healing doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers in small bowls of strange new seeds that gently rebuild what stress and sugar have torn down. And just when Fletcher thought he had seen the full picture, grains he could embrace, seeds he could trust, one more name appeared, a grain he'd never even heard of, but it would bring his journey full circle, not because it was more powerful, but because it reminded him of where he started and how far he'd come. It was a quiet Sunday when Fletcher discovered the last one. He had started spending more time at the local library, not for books really, but for the peace. He liked sitting by the window, flipping through health magazines, sometimes jotting things into a small pocket notebook Dana gave him. That's where he first saw the word amaranth, tucked into an article about forgotten grains that could support blood sugar and reduce inflammation. It didn't look like much, tiny, pale, almost too small to matter. But something about it pulled him in. It reminded him of himself in a way, overlooked, underestimated, a small thing carrying weight nobody could see. He picked up a small bag at the health store that week, and when he poured it into his palm that evening, the grains felt like sand. How does something so small do so much? He wondered aloud. He cooked it gently in a saucepan with water and a splash of almond milk, added chia seeds, and stirred slowly as the grains swelled. When he took the first bite, he paused. It had a texture he hadn't felt before, somewhere between quinoa and porridge, soft but with a quiet strength. That first bowl wasn't dramatic, but it stayed with him. Hours later, he noticed that his energy never dipped. His stomach felt settled. And when he tested his blood sugar the next morning, it was perfectly steady. No spikes, no drops. A few days later, Fletcher looked up amaranth again. He read that it was technically a seed, not a grain, but acted like one. That it had 9 grams of protein per cup, nearly 5 grams of fiber, and a rare set of antioxidants that helped reduce inflammation at the cellular level. It supported blood vessels, eye health, and insulin sensitivity. All the things he was working so hard to protect. But what struck him most was this: it could be popped like popcorn. The next evening, he tried it in a dry skillet. The tiny grains puffed up one by one like magic. He laughed, actually laughed. "Well, would you look at that," he said to the empty kitchen. He sprinkled the amaranth over yogurt, tossed some into a salad, and later that week, folded it into veggie patties. It was small, but it was mighty, and that made it feel like a secret, a gentle power. At his next appointment, he brought me something unusual, his notepad. He slid it across the desk and said, "I think I've got it now." I looked down. There were 6 entries: steel-cut oats and quinoa, barley, brown rice, buckwheat, amaranth. He tapped the page. Each of these made me feel something different, stronger, clearer, lighter, calmer. He paused. But all together, they gave me my life back. And he was right. His blood work showed it. His posture showed it. Even his voice had changed, fuller, more certain. He didn't sound like a man dodging illness anymore. He sounded like someone living. Fletcher's journey wasn't just about swapping grains. It was about rewriting the story he'd told himself about aging, about food, about failure. It was about healing without punishment, changing without fear, and eating without shame. His choices didn't just lower his blood sugar, they gave him back the rhythm of his days, the steadiness of his steps, the clarity of his mornings. And now, whenever he makes his amaranth porridge, he stirs slowly, like it's a prayer. Not because he has to, but because he chooses to. That to me is the heart of healing, not the perfect diet, not the strict control, but the moment a person realizes they're allowed to feel good again. Fletcher never planned to become an expert in grains. He was just trying to feel better, to stop the tingling in his hands, the fog in his mind, the ache in his knees that made getting out of bed feel like a chore. But somehow, along the way, each small bowl, each mindful bite, each new grain on that yellow notepad became something more than food. They became proof that change was possible. That age didn't mean decline. That healing wasn't behind him. It was within him. He didn't talk about it much, not in big ways. Fletcher was still the same quiet, thoughtful man who folded his newspaper neatly each morning and brewed his coffee just so. But his neighbors noticed he walked farther now. Dana noticed he laughed more, real laughter, not the polite kind. And his doctor noticed something too. Fletcher no longer feared the numbers on his blood test. He welcomed them like feedback, not judgment. One crisp morning, he stood in his kitchen holding that worn-out notepad. The list was still there, his 6 grains, written with care, but beneath them he had added something new. Patience, listening, joy, because somewhere between oats and amaranth, Fletcher had discovered that health wasn't just numbers or food groups, it was how you show up for yourself. what you believe you deserve, and whether you treat your body like a problem or a partner. He still had days where things felt off. A little stiffness here, a bit of fatigue there, but those days didn't scare him anymore because now he had tools, he had trust, and he had a new kind of strength, one built not from force, but from attention. So when people asked him, "How did you change things?" he didn't talk about fiber or glycemic loads. He just said, "I started feeding myself things that loved me back." And really, isn't that what we all deserve? Fletcher didn't realize how long it had been since he'd hosted dinner, not since before the diagnosis, not since the numbness, the fear, the questions about every bite. For a while, his table had become a quiet place. No guests, no laughter, just meals eaten in silence while he tried to guess how his body would respond. But now, something had shifted. The food was no longer the enemy. The table no longer felt like a battleground. So on a Thursday afternoon, with the windows open and a soft breeze in the kitchen, Fletcher did something he hadn't done in almost a year. He set the table for guests. Just Dana and her 2 boys, nothing fancy, just a meal made with his own hands, using the grains that had carried him through this quiet storm. There was a salad with quinoa and roasted vegetables, a warm barley stew, a side of sautéed greens with garlic and olive oil, and in the center, a bowl of wild rice, the latest addition to his list, tossed with mushrooms and fresh thyme. It was simple, but it was full. Full of flavor, full of love, full of the man he had become. When Dana arrived, she smiled wide. "This smells incredible," she said, stepping inside. Fletcher waved it off with a shy grin, but there was pride in his eyes. The boys helped set out the napkins. They sat together, all 4 of them, and Fletcher looked around the table and thought, I made this possible." Dinner was full of small talk and stories, but halfway through the meal, Dana leaned in and said softly, "You know, you seem lighter, Dad. Not just healthier, lighter." He didn't answer right away. He looked down at his plate, at the wild rice that used to scare him, at the barley that kept him calm, at the quinoa that started it all. And then he said, "I'm not carrying fear anymore. That's the difference." After they left, Fletcher stood in the kitchen, washing the dishes with warm water running over his fingers that no longer tingled. He stacked the bowls, dried the plates, and when the room was quiet again, he returned to the notepad one more time. This time, he didn't add a grain. He wrote just 3 words under the list. "I feel ready." Ready for what? He didn't know exactly, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that the dread had turned into direction. That food no longer felt like a trap. That health no longer felt like punishment. That dinner, once again, felt like home. It happened on a Wednesday morning. Fletcher was out walking, not with a goal, not with a Fitbit, not for numbers. Just walking because it felt good, because the sky was soft and blue, because his knees didn't protest like they used to, because for once, he didn't feel like he had to chase his health. It was walking with him. He reached the edge of the trail where the trees opened up into a little clearing. It was nothing special, just grass and dandelions and the sound of birdsong, but something about it made him stop. He stood there for a while, hands in his pockets, chest rising and falling, and he realized something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. He was at peace with his body, not proud, not triumphant, not even better, just peaceful. And that was new because for most of his life, Fletcher's relationship with his body had been one of quiet frustration. It had slowed him down, gained weight, gotten stiff, got sick, didn't bounce back the way it used to. And when the blood sugar warnings came, it felt like yet another betrayal. But now, standing there under the trees, he realized something else. Something gentle and true. His body had never betrayed him. It had spoken, whispered, asked for help, and he hadn't always listened. That wasn't failure, that was just life. But now he was listening, and his body, in its own quiet way, was saying thank you. When he got home, he poured himself a cup of tea and opened the pantry. He looked at the shelves, neatly organized now, filled with jars of oats, buckwheat, barley, quinoa, wild rice, amaranth. Each one had a story, each one had played a role in his healing. And as he reached for a bag of millet, a new grain Dana had just brought over, he smiled. Because it wasn't just about the millet, it was about the man he had become while learning how to cook it. A man who paid attention, a man who asked questions, a man who forgave himself for not knowing sooner. Later that evening, he called me, not for advice, just to share. I think I've finally made peace with food, he said, and maybe with myself too. I listened quietly, then said, "That's the real healing, Fletcher. The numbers are just the echo." The first time Fletcher opened that yellow notepad, he was scared. He was 66, pre-diabetic, and confused. His hands tingled, his vision blurred, and the foods he once trusted, toast, rice, even cereal, had become strangers. That notepad started as a lifeline, a place to list grains that didn't hurt him, a way to make sense of the mess. But 10 months later, that same notepad sat in his kitchen drawer, worn, creased, but never thrown away. He didn't need it anymore, not because he remembered every fact, but because the fear was gone. Fletcher had built something stronger than a list. He had built a rhythm, a way of eating that wasn't driven by fear or rules, but by kindness. Every meal, every grain, every portion, they were choices rooted in care, not control. And that difference, as small as it seemed, had rewritten everything. His blood sugar was steady now. His vision hadn't worsened. His knees carried him without complaint. But most of all, his mind was clear. His mornings were lighter. His laughter came easier. And he no longer stared down food like it was a threat. One evening, Dana came over for dinner again. She noticed the candle lit on the table, the soft jazz playing in the background, the smell of cumin and roasted vegetables. "What's the occasion?" she asked, taking off her coat. Fletcher shrugged. "Just felt like celebrating." They sat down, a bowl of mila pilaf with sautéed greens, grilled chicken, and a cucumber salad. Simple, nourishing, familiar. As they ate, Dana looked around and smiled. "It's hard to believe this is the same kitchen," she said. "You used to be afraid of everything in here." Fletcher laughed softly. "Yeah, and now it's where I feel safest." Later that night, alone with the dishes washed and the house quiet, he stood at the table for a moment longer. Then, for the first time, he picked up the yellow notepad and closed it, not out of finality, but because the story it had helped write was now living inside him. And just before placing it back in the drawer, he wrote one last line at the bottom of the page. "My body is not broken, it's learning, and so am I." He folded the cover gently, as if closing a chapter, not with sadness, but with reverence, because healing had come not in some dramatic fix, but in small bowls, in quiet mornings, in simple meals made with intention. And that, my friend, is the power of listening, of softness, of one grain at a time. Fletcher's journey didn't begin with strength. It began with fear. Fear of numbers he didn't understand, symptoms he couldn't control, and foods he thought he had to give up forever. But what made his story powerful wasn't a perfect diet or strict discipline. It was the quiet, steady transformation of a man who chose to listen, not just to his doctors, but to his own body. He went from fearing every grain to embracing the ones that loved him back, from skipping meals in confusion to building meals that brought him comfort, from isolating himself in silence to filling his home with the scent of healing food and the laughter of people he loved. And maybe most importantly, he shifted from thinking his body was failing to realizing it was simply asking for help. And finally, he knew how to give it. If you saw yourself in Fletcher, even just a little, let this be your gentle invitation. Start where he started, with one bowl, one choice, one moment of paying attention. You don't need to change everything overnight. Just begin to ask, what does my body need to feel safe again? Because you deserve to feel clear, strong, and steady. Because healing is not about restriction, it's about connection. And because sometimes the smallest changes are the ones that bring us home to ourselves. Let this be your quiet beginning, your next step, your first yes back to you.